We have a number of things that will fit in today, including, I see Paul Churchland's here, so he'll do his famous impersonation of Dan Dennett, risen from the hospital bed, and deliver Dan's message. We have a couple of photographs as well. Those of you who have not seen yet Time magazine, because it probably hasn't arrived at your house or your hotel yet, the cover story is God versus Science, which is an interview that David Van Beamer, the religion editor, conducted with Richard Dawkins and with Francis Collins, and I actually printed the thing out, so there's a few clips, a few things that we can ask Richard about a little bit later on. Basically what we're going to do today, although as you know it might morph a little, is kick off with Paul Davies and then go into this is basically one of those if not God then what sessions. What kind of a universe could we be talking about? And what kind of a story can we be telling? So we'll start with Paul Davies and then bring in some Spinoza from Steve Nadler and Loyal Rue and Annie Drian and Mel Connor. And then after the break, we'll get into the philosophy. The philosophers have been telling me that this all is way too unwieldy and there really needs some clear thinking here. So the philosophers, the philosophers want to speak. No, but that will be happening. We'll be doing the Can You Be Good Without God after the break, and that may go on a little bit. And then in the afternoon we'll kick off with Richard and Harry Croteau, and then there's a few things that I want to amend after that. So, but first of all, Paul Davies. Paul, physicist, English-born, spent a lot of his time in Australia at Macquarie, has just relocated to Arizona State University and is the author of many good books on communicating this whole issue to a general public. His latest one is called The Goldilocks Enigma, which I assume means that somewhere there's a universe that's just right.
That's it,
okay.
yes.
Paul Davies.
You know the story. All right. Well, thank you, Roger. With the exception of Richard Dawkins' brief intervention yesterday afternoon, I think this is the first time you've heard from a non-US participant. And whilst I found yesterday's deliberations deeply disturbing, viewed from outside the United States, the situation about religion here, its place in society, seems to be, frankly, a bizarre aberration. Countries like Britain and Australia, where I've spent most of my life, are in effect post-religious societies, although I'm sure Richard feels that the corpse is still twitching. But nevertheless, for most people and in most aspects of public life, religion plays a role which is just largely ceremonial, if at all. So I want to move on from what I found was somewhat of a parochial discussion yesterday to move the discussion to a different plane. I'm myself not a religious person in any conventional sense, but I do share something that came up yesterday in the discussion, what we might call Einstein's cosmic religious feeling. My interest is not so much in the role of religion in society. I mean, I follow that with some concern, of course, but like Richard, my interest is really in the deep nature of reality. And what can science tell us about these age-old cosmic mysteries? And in fact, can we demystify the universe using science? So I'd like to talk today about this famous cosmic religious feeling. Is it just vacuous? Is this just a poetic way of talking about a godless world? Or does it have some actual useful content? I'm going to start, therefore, by making the assumption, there's a little phrase that I sometimes use, no miracles except the miracle of nature itself. So I'm going to proceed on the assumption that there isn't a cosmic magician, there isn't a super being who intervenes from time to time in the universe and works miracles. I don't like that idea. I can't prove it doesn't happen, but I want to proceed on the assumption that it doesn't, that what we're dealing with is a magnificent natural system subject to natural laws, and ask a deeper level of question, such as could the universe have been different? Why are there laws of nature? Where have they come from, and why do they have the form that they do? Why are they mathematical? And above all, one question that seems to get left out of a lot of these discussions, why are these laws comprehensible to human beings? So here the situation's less clear-cut, because although science has advanced tremendously in the last 400 years, many of these questions have been asked for centuries, and they still vex us today. So this or that particular discovery in particle physics or cosmology really doesn't get too much to the heart of the matter concerning the questions that I have just outlined. Now, even atheistic scientists, for example, Steven Weinberg, will wax lyrical about the majesty, harmony, elegance, and sheer ingenuity of the universe. And I'd like to try to convey in the words that I find most congenial this sense of cosmic religious feeling, as Einstein has expressed it. And the best way I can put it is as follows, that as the great cosmic drama unfolds before us, it seems as if there's some sort of script or scheme of things, and of course I'm using these words metaphorically, to which its evolution is conforming. And so we're bound to ask who or what wrote the script, or did the script somehow miraculously write itself? Is this great cosmic text or subtext of nature laid down once and for all, or is it perhaps changing with time? Is the universe or its invisible author making it up as it goes along? And is it the only drama being staged, or is our universe just one of many shows in town? That's, of course, using metaphorical language. But I want to dwell on the fact that the universe does conform to an orderly scheme. It's not just an arbitrary muddle of phenomena and events. And that prompts one to wonder, quite apart from whether there's a God or no God, whether there is something like meaning or purpose behind it all. Now, many scientists are quick to pour scorn even on this weaker suggestion. So, for example, Richard Feynman, and I quote, said, "The great accumulation of understanding as to how the physical world behaves only convinces one that this behavior has a kind of meaninglessness about it." And that's a sentiment echoed in the famous words of Steven Weinberg, "The more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless." And it's interesting to note that Steven was criticized by some of his colleagues for this remark, not because he denied that the universe had a point, but for the fact that he even suggested it could have a point. So now, can we take words like meaning and purpose, which are, after all, categories devised from human discourse, and project them onto the universe? Well, obviously, we must take care in so doing. But I'd like to point out that all attempts to describe the universe ultimately stem from human concepts. Science proceeds precisely from taking things from the realm of human discourse and human experience, often practical experience, and projecting them onto nature. And I'll give you a trivial example, which is politically correct to talk about, and that is to say that Newton, and Laplace after him, described the universe as a gigantic clockwork machine. Now, a machine is, of course, a human construct, and mechanism is a human concept, just as much as purpose. So we have to realize that there's nothing wrong with saying the universe is a machine. Mechanism captures, albeit imperfectly, something of what the universe is about. And the question is, can we use other words that capture other aspects of what the universe is about? Well, can we tease out some common ground here? I think we can. I think all scientists would agree that doing science means figuring out what is going on in the world, what the universe is up to, what it's about. If it isn't about anything, you wouldn't be a scientist. There'd be no good reason to embark on the scientific quest in the first place, because you'd have no rational basis for believing that as you dug to deeper and deeper levels, what you'd uncover would be additional coherent and meaningful facts about the world. Experience shows that as we go deeper and deeper into our inquiry into nature, using scientific methods, we continue to find rational and meaningful order rather than just a haphazard jumble of unrelated phenomena. And scientists proceed on the assumption that there is a coherent scheme of things out there to be uncovered. Now, it's an act of faith. as Hume long ago pointed out, we have no logical reason to suppose just because the sun rose today, it's going to rise again tomorrow. But scientists assume that we live in a universe governed by a rational order as enshrined in the laws of nature. And that's an act of faith. It's one that I share. So we might teasingly invert Stephen's aphorism and say that the more the universe seems pointless, the more it also seems incomprehensible. Now, this great cosmic scheme, maybe the words purpose and meaning are too much of a stretch, but there's one word I'd like to try out on you and see where we go, and that's the word ingenuity. The universe does strike me, and I think most scientists, as being astonishingly ingenious in the way it's put together. So can we legitimately describe nature itself as clever or ingenious? Are these qualities intrinsic to nature, or are we simply projecting them onto nature? Could it be we who weave the tapestry of dazzling intellectual subtlety from what is at rock bottom just a banality? Or to put it metaphorically, might nature be a fiendishly clever bit of trickery, the dabblings of a simpleton masquerading as a work of pure genius? I think this gets us to the heart of the matter. Now, we physicists, somewhat arrogantly perhaps, tend to think that the laws of physics are the bedrock of physical reality, the starting point of all scientific explanations. I want to ask, where do the laws of physics come from? Why do they have the form that they do? And in particular, why do they have a form that permits the emergence of living organisms and sentient beings like us who can gaze in wonder at the world about them and reflect on the meaning of existence? Where do these laws come from? There's more to it than us being mere observers. Human beings can do more than just watch the show. Through science and mathematics, which are themselves a product of the human intellect and subject, therefore, to the vagaries of biological evolution, but through science and mathematics, they have yielded the key to the universe. We've uncovered the hidden mathematical subtext as revealed through the invisible laws of nature. And finding this key to the universe was by no means inevitable. I often wonder that if an asteroid had hit Europe 1,000 years ago, whether science, as we know it, would ever have emerged. So you'd never guess, by looking at the world about you, that there is this hidden subtext of nature, this hidden mathematical order. When Newton saw the apple fall, what he saw was a falling apple. What he deduced was a set of mathematical laws that link the motion of the apple to the motion of the moon and other bodies. So this underlying subtext of nature, these laws, are not apparent from daily life. You have to put in a lot of intellectual effort, but also follow arcane procedures of scientific inquiry to uncover them. So it's an extraordinary thing. We take science for granted, but actually I think we are incredibly privileged to be able to decode nature in this way. The fact that science has uncovered this hidden mathematical order in nature means that we've been made privy to the rules on which the universe runs. How's this come about? How's the universe engineered not just its own self-awareness, but its own comprehension? Mindless, blundering atoms conspiring to make not just life, not just mind, but understanding. Beings who are not able to merely watch the show, but to unravel the plot. Or could it just be a fluke? Might the fact that the deepest level of reality is connected to a quirky natural phenomenon we call the human mind just represent nothing more than a bizarre and temporary aberration in an absurd and pointless universe? Well, maybe that's the case. But I'm always uncomfortable about shrugging aside what seems to be a very significant, a key fact about the world, that it contains thinking beings able to understand, at least in part, what's going on in nature. It seems like a bit of a cop-out to say, well, it's just a fluke, let's move on and not worry about it anymore. And I have long been fascinated to know whether I can come up, or we can come up, with a deeper, more rational explanation, something that tries to connect in a more satisfying way our existence as reflective, comprehending beings with a universe that permits such beings to exist. Now, what sort of explanation might that be? Well, before I explain what it is, I'd like to summarize the standard responses to the question, where do the laws of physics come from? Why do they have the form that they do? Why are they bio-friendly? Why are they mathematical? And so on. Now, one answer, a glib answer, is to just say, well, God made them that way, end of story. Well, it is, of course, the end of discussion, if that's the point of view you take. A familiar scientific answer is to declare that there is no reason at all why the laws of physics are what they are. No reason at all. That's just what they are. That's it. The laws exist reasonlessly. Now, if that is the case, then the universe is ultimately absurd by definition, if there is no reason for why it is as it is. The trouble with that answer is that we must then accept that the mighty edifice of science, founded as it is on logical and rational necessity, the notion that there are reasons for why physical phenomena occur, and that explanation should be logical, is ultimately rooted in absurdity. Can a truly, deeply absurd universe so convincingly mimic a rational one? Well, another response to this is to claim that the laws are uniquely determined by logical and mathematical necessity from some future theory of everything. And as some of you may know, string theory or M theory is a contender. This would be a theory, it is said, with no free parameters, so that the world simply has to be as it is, no choice. I think this claim is so obviously false that I'm not going to dwell on it further here because of time limitations. It can come up in discussion time. I think it's simply wrong for obvious reasons. An increasingly popular scientific response to these questions that I've outlined is to appeal to the notion of a multiverse. Came up briefly yesterday. In this scheme, it said that what we've all along been calling the universe is nothing of the sort. It is just an infinitesimal fragment of a vast, much more elaborate system of many universes, which seems to go under the name of multiverse. Some people prefer megaverse. Now, to make this idea work, you have to assume that these laws of physics, which are otherwise so mysterious, vary from one cosmic patch to another. That is to say that these are not absolute universal eternal laws. They are more like local bylaws or state laws. So just as you have laws in California and laws in Arizona and so on, there's laws in our universe, and if you go to the universe next door, over there, you'll find that maybe those laws are different. And maybe they vary randomly from universe to universe, and then it's no surprise we find ourselves living in a universe consistent with life, because we could scarcely find ourselves in a universe that was hostile to life. So it becomes an anthropic selection effect, is the terminology that people use. Now, a credible mechanism for generating a patchwork quilt of universes of this manner comes from inflationary universe cosmology. I don't have time to discuss this, except to say that it's a mechanism whereby Big Bangs, Stephen Weinberg was referring to this yesterday, Big Bangs sort of pop out, or maybe they're little bangs, pop out of some eternally inflating matrix or background. And in that manner, because of quantum uncertainty, one can populate a vast landscape of different possibilities as predicted by some versions of string theory. So that's the idea, and it's been much discussed. So like baby bear's porridge in the story of Goldilocks, the universe seems to be suspiciously just right for life. But if there is a multiverse of all possible variations of universes, then maybe that's no surprise. Well, this seems progress of a sort, and I say 2 cheers for the multiverse, but it falls short of a complete explanation of existence, because to get the theory to work, you've got to assume a lot of things. For example, a universe-generating mechanism. You have to have a way of populating all of these different patches, so you need a set of meta-laws to generate all the laws, and you need space and time and so on. In fact, in the favored way of generating the multiverse, using inflationary cosmology and M theory, there's a host of other baggage, such as quantum mechanics and general relativity and other things I won't bore you with, that you have to assume to get the thing to work. So it's only partway there. What you've done, the multiverse is a help, but it's really shifted the problem up a level from universe to multiverse. So it still doesn't really get us to the bottom of all this. Now, the problem with these, both of these credible scientific explanations, and this is a problem they've inherited from monotheistic theology, is that they both appeal to something outside the universe in order to explain what's in it, and in particular the laws. So in the first case, one has to believe in an unexplained set of physical laws, a package of marvels that just happens to be. And in the second case, one has an unexplained universe-generating and law-generating mechanism, not to mention a vast array of invisible universes to make that work. So the theistic explanation of the universe likewise appeals to the existence of an unexplained, transcendent God. So both of these styles of explanation fall short of a complete explanation of existence. They require one to accept on faith something, in fact quite a lot, that is outside the universe, that lies beyond. Now there's a famous metaphor that makes this point quite well, and I'm sure you've heard it, but I'll just repeat it. It's a lecturer giving a lecture of this sort, and partway through a woman stands up at the back and says, you may be very clever, but I know how the universe is put together. Pray tell us, says the lecturer. Well, the earth stands on the back of an elephant, which stands on the back of a turtle. And here it is. To which the lecturer replies, well, what then is the turtle standing on? You may be very clever, young man. You can't fool me. It's turtles all the way down. So I'm sure you know this. Now, it's a light-hearted anecdote, but I think it goes a long way to pointing out what we're up against with all attempts to come up with ultimate explanations of existence. Because to explain something in the everyday sense of the word means you have to start somewhere. You have to assume something as given, something which you regard as self-evidently true and so reasonable you don't question it, and then you build upon that in a logical or rational chain of explanation. And the archetype for this is proving geometrical theorems. Greek geometry founded on the axioms of Euclid start with these axioms, you don't question them, and then you use them to prove things like Pythagoras' theorem. So sticking to this herpetological metaphor then, the axioms of geometry represent a sort of levitating super turtle that holds the rest up. And so the same general explanation applies when we come to the universe and the underlying laws. That there is this temptation to appeal to a levitating super turtle and simply say that is as far as we go, we accept that as given, and everything else is based upon it. So just as God can't explain God's self, so the laws of physics or science can't explain science. These are both levitating super turtles. Now, the trouble is that one person's super turtle is another person's laughingstock. So scientists who would like to have a theory of everything, for them, say, M theory is going to be their levitating super turtle. That's their starting point. The equations of that theory, if they can ever be written down, are simply accepted as given, an unexplained package upon which all of physical existence is erected. Multiverse devotees, by contrast, they accept this extraordinary package of marvels, including a universe-generating mechanism, a law-generating mechanism, quantum mechanics, relativity, and a whole lot of other stuff. Monotheistic theologians cast a necessary God in the role of super turtle, and all three camps denounce the others in equally derisive terms. And I've been following this debate in one form or another for about 30 years, and I find it very depressing that usually at the end of meetings like this, it boils down to my super turtle is better than your super turtle. Now, can't we do better than this? Isn't there some way we can move the discussion on by breaking out of this whole trap of the Tower of Turtles? I'm not the first person to suggest that, and in writing my book, I found myself more and more drawn to the ideas of the physicist John Wheeler, who will be very familiar to the physicists here. Wheeler was regarded as one of the greatest physicists of the 20th century, but with some ideas which pushed the frontiers of understanding, to say the least. But he was, his famous phrase was that he liked the Tower of Turtles idea, but he said that there are no laws except the law, that there is no law. And I took this as the starting point to try to come up with a sort of turtle-free explanation of existence. What I'm groping towards here, and I'm completely open-minded about this, it's a new program of investigation, instead of appealing to something outside the universe, either an unexplained God or an unexplained set of physical laws, is it possible that the explanation for the universe lies within it? In other words, can the explanation for the universe and the universe itself co-emerge in some manner? In the brief time that's left to me, I can give you an outline sketch of how I think this could work. But it does depend upon having a radical change in our understanding of the nature of physical law. And I've done a complete U-turn on this. I used to be a strong Platonist when it comes to the laws of physics, like many of my colleagues. And I think I've converted myself to the opposite point of view. Now, Plato famously envisaged mathematical relationships as existing in some sort of transcendent heaven, a heaven of perfect geometrical and mathematical forms. So circles, for example, drawn in the real world will always be flawed approximations of perfect circles which exist in this transcendent Platonic realm. And physicists have inherited, I'll come back to that in a second, physicists have inherited this Platonic point of view, that when you ask a physicist like Steven Weinberg, where are these laws of physics? Where do they come from? Where do they reside? Are they real? You'll usually be told, well, they sort of exist in this Platonic heaven of mathematical forms. And so in the simplest picture where there's just one Big Bang and the universe comes into exist, these mathematical laws are just imprinted on the Big Bang at its birth by magic. They're just there, and they're eternal, unchanging, fixed laws because they're inherited from this Platonic heaven. Well, as long as these laws are fixed and imprinted from without, I don't think we're ever going to come up with an explanation for the bio-friendly nature of the universe. It'll always seem like a fluke or a miracle. But if one gets away from that notion that the laws of physics are sort of God-given or imposed from without by magic, and regards them in a rather different way, then I think there is a chance of perhaps explaining some of these deeper mysteries. And in the 1 minute or so that I've got left, I'm going to just outline my strategy for doing that. So rather than regarding the laws of physics as idealized, perfect, transcendent mathematical relationships, one could instead think of them more in terms of software, that is, like programs being run on the great cosmic computer. Now, for most practical purposes, it makes no difference whether you think of the laws as imposed from without and infinitely precise, or chugging along with the hardware. But there are circumstances, in fact, in which there is a very significant difference. So by regarding the laws as being emergent with and intrinsic to, rather than transcendent of and imprinted upon the universe, that does lead to circumstances in which there are differences in our predictions. And I want to give you a couple of these examples. Before I do that, I want to point out that one of the mysteries that I have alluded to is the fact that the laws of nature are mathematical. And this is a famous problem that physicists like to talk about over coffee. If you're a Platonist, you can think of mathematics as a sort of infinite warehouse of wonderful mathematical objects and relationships. It's sort of out there. It's a resource available to Mother Nature, who's come in and sort of plucked a few choice samples out of this warehouse and used them for the laws of physics. And it's a complete mystery in the conventional way of looking at the laws of physics as to why this is so. Where does mathematics come from? Where do the laws of physics come from? But if we think of the laws of physics as, and indeed of mathematics, as intrinsic to the universe, like the software on the great cosmic computer, if we think of it that way, then we have a possibility of explaining mathematics and physical law as part of a common package. They co-emerge. And I should say that this is not my idea, that Paul Benioff, one of the founders of the quantum theory of computation, was the first person to suggest this notion, that mathematics and physics really, rather than just assuming mathematics exists and then plucking the laws of physics out of midair, one might hope that we explain the nature of mathematics and physical law from a common source. Now, I've said that I'm going to give a couple of examples where it matters as to whether we think of the laws as intrinsic to and software in the universe or Platonic. And there are two, well, first of all, let me tell you why there should be a difference. If we think of the universe as like a gigantic information processing system, then the striking thing about it is it's a finite system. You can actually add up the number of bits of information in the universe. It turns out to be 10 to the power 122. It's not a hard calculation, and there's not really any doubt about that number. So it's a huge number. For most practical purposes, it makes no difference. There's plenty of information there to go round, so to speak. The number, by the way, is enshrined in something that physicists call the holographic principle, which relates to Jacob Bekenstein and Stephen Hawking's concept of the event horizon area of a black hole being a measure of its entropy, which is related to its information content. I won't dwell on the technicalities. But there is a sort of deep reason why this 10 to the 122 comes from. So expressed informally then, the laws of software imply that there will be a sort of inherent fuzziness or wiggle room in the operation of the physical laws, simply because they don't have infinite fidelity. You see, so long as Mother Nature can compute in this transcendent Platonic realm of perfect mathematical forms, she can do so to infinite precision. That's what Newton assumed, infinitely precise clockwork mechanism. But if it's really a finite state system, then that's a fiction. We simply cannot invoke calculative routines in describing the world that exhaust its computational resources. What does it mean to say that we have a state of the world which cannot be even specified without more bits of information than can be contained, even in principle, in the entire observable universe? Are there such states? Well, there are indeed. And I'll give you an example, because it's a curious one. In quantum mechanics, particles can be entangled together. It's a technical term. I won't go into what it is, except you'll probably have heard Einstein's famous phrase, ghostly action at a distance. And it means that particles can be spatially separated, but linked in some way. The great hope of the quantum computing industry, which would represent an exponential leap over the conventional computing industry, is to entangle together a large number of particles, electrons, atoms, or whatever, to use the thing to compute. It turns out that an entangled state of just 400 particles already hits this 10 to the 122 limit. In other words, it's impossible to even specify, let alone predict the behavior of a state of more than 400 entangled particles. Now, for most people steeped in the Platonic tradition, they say, so what? You know, Mother Nature will be able to compute what these things do. But if you really think that the laws of physics are inherent in the universe, this limit of 400 entangled particles represents a problem. And I'm going to stick my neck out and say that I will predict that if we create such a state, that what physicists would call the unitary evolution of this state would break down. Something funny would happen. Now, seeing as that the industry has set its sights on 10,000 entangled particles, it could be of practical significance. And it's something that may be tested in the near future. So it could actually matter as to whether the laws are infinitely precise Platonic things or whether they're, as it were, in the universe. And I'm getting very near to the end now, in case you're getting a bit bored with this. The other circumstance in which it might matter is in the very early universe. When the universe was smaller, it could contain less information, and the fuzziness of these laws would have been correspondingly greater. So according to this view, the universe and its laws could have co-emerged with the laws sharpening over time onto what we see now from a sort of fuzzy beginning. And again, John Wheeler was there years and years ago. He said everything comes out of higgledy-piggledy. There are no laws, except the law that there is no law, and it's an emergent quality. So I've drawn very much upon his work, upon the work of Paul Benioff. I've mentioned Seth Lloyd, Andre Lindy, David Deutsch, and Rolf Landau have all contributed to this view, which I've woven together in my own personal manner, but components of it can be found among the work of other physicists. So lastly, well, how does this matter? How can we use this to explain the Goldilocks enigma, the existence of observers and beings like ourselves, and deep questions like why are we here and why is the universe bio-friendly? Is there a connection? Is the fact that the laws are, as it were, malleable and fuzzy in the past, can that be somehow used to explain the bio-friendliness of the universe that emerged? Well, I think it can, but I'm not sure how much time I've got. What I should probably do is to just say in a few words what I have in mind here, and then if there is time, or in question time, I can show one or two slides to make it clearer. But I want to motivate it by just appealing to some work that Stephen Hawking published last year. When you apply quantum mechanics to the universe as a whole, which is what we're doing here, in the standard way of doing it, you dream up some sort of wave function for the universe, or quantum state for the universe, which would have been the state at the beginning, at the Big Bang, and then you evolve it forward in time using mathematics, and then you draw consequences of what branches of the wave function are here and there and so on. But Hawking points out that, of course, that's not the way we do science, not the way human beings enter into the equation. Human beings observe the universe here and now, and we infer the past from present observations. Now, quantum mechanics is perfectly time-symmetric. Now, any of you thinking Stuart Hameroff at this stage, stop. This is this stuff is okay. So the laws of physics are perfectly symmetric in time. So when we retrodict the past, just when we predict the future in quantum mechanics, there's a fuzziness and uncertainty. And the technical way of saying that is that the present state of the universe is an amalgam or a superposition of different branches, evolutionary branches of the wave function, all leading to this, all together leading up to this point. And so the act of observation is an act of selection or pruning of this different sort of multiverse of different branches. And so Hawking points out that there is a sort of backwards in time effect, but it's not a backwards in time causation. It's not that what happens now changes what happens in the past. It's just that what happens in the past has an inherent quantum fuzziness or indeterminism by the very nature of quantum mechanics. And that observations made now resolve, in part, that ambiguity in the past. Now, this is not in doubt, and I could show some experiments that have been done to confirm it on a small scale. This aspect of quantum mechanics, weird though it is not in doubt. It's a sort of non-locality, which is across space, but also across time. So it's not a question of sending information or physical effects back into the past, but it's an effect of acknowledging that the past is not completely and totally defined until we make observations and resolve that ambiguity. And all I'm suggesting, that's the part that isn't radical. It sounds radical, but that I think is accepted by most physicists. The part that's radical is to say, what if we extend that ambiguity resolution from the state of the universe, that is the states of all the particles and fields and so on, where it's accepted that that is part of normal quantum mechanics, what if we extend that to the laws that underpin them? So instead of taking fixed Platonic laws and fuzzy states that can be resolved through observations, supposing the laws themselves are fuzzy for the reasons I've outlined here, then we see how observers connect to the laws in this deeper quasi-mechanistic manner. Now, this is what John Wheeler would call not an idea so much as an idea for an idea. It's the outline of a research program, but it's one that I think could provide this linkage between space, time, laws, life, and observers without appealing to anything outside the universe as God-given or imposed upon it from outside. So that's all I have to say. I think it's progress of assault, but it's work in progress. Thank you.
Perhaps just one or two very quick questions, because I actually want to... Terry.
So I remember...
you know the rules.
Terry Sainovsky. I had the privilege of working with John Wheeler over 30 years ago, and I remember him saying way back then, "It from bit."
Right.
And he likes his little slogans. It from bit.
From bit.
It from bit. That the universe, particles come out of piece of information, a program, as you say, running on a computer. But it seems to me that just replaces the turtle with the computer.
Well, I showed the sort of turtle loop, and I think you're quite right. If all you want to do is to make information primary and matter then come from it. If I'd had a longer talk, I would have showed a slide of precisely that. You know, in the conventional way, you've got mathematics at the bottom, laws of physics, then you've got matter, then you've got information, then you've got understanding, you know, in a sort of great chain of being. And just flipping over the bottom ones doesn't really get you there. What you need to do is to, and in fact, well, it was up there, it's a self-synthesizing loop where each of these things supports the other. I showed the turtle loop briefly. So that's what I'm after. Now, of course, people still say, well, that doesn't, it's still not an ultimate explanation for existence, because even if everything explains everything else in this loopy manner, you could still say, well, why that particular loop? Why does that exist rather than some other self-consistent loop? Well, it could be that all self-consistent loops are out there somewhere, and this is just one of them. But I think that's better than just sort of having the Tower of Turtles and a levitating super turtle and just declaring that's it. Because we will never, ever resolve these issues about I prefer a transcendent God, I prefer mind at the bottom, I prefer mathematics at the bottom, I prefer superstring Lagrangian. How are we ever going to resolve that?
Paul Churchland, Professor Davies. There is a possibility within the neighborhood of possibilities you've scouted in your talk that you didn't mention, and I'd like your comment on it. Let me start with an analogy. Young children often think that there's only a finite number of numbers and there is a biggest number, and they're rather shocked to learn that there isn't one. Right. And one might say the same thing about the sequence of theories that intellectual communities produce over time. Our theories get deeper and more accurate and more penetrating, and each explains to some degree the success of its precursor and so forth. And so here we're looking at a stack of theories, and there is a possibility that the question, how do we explain the fundamental theory, supposing there is one? That question could be answered, well, you're assuming that there is one. Perhaps right. Theories just get more and more and more successful.
It's turtles all the way down.
Ad infinitum. But the turtles change. The turtles change. They're not identical turtles. And I'm here suggesting that theories are, after all, creations of cognitive creatures made in an attempt to understand the universe around them. And if the universe is, as it may be, infinitely complex, and any machine inside it will be finitely complex, then any such creature, such as ourselves, are doomed to have at most a partial understanding of what's going on. Right. And that will endure forever, even though we'll get a better and better and better grasp.
Yes, I hope you're wrong. And of course, it is often said that all we're doing is just making successive approximations to, the truth or something that's out there, or just building better and better models of reality. Again, Stephen Hawking did one of his famous U-turns on this very issue, because if one appeals to Gödel's incompleteness theorem, there's a very deep sense in which you can never know that you've got the last word on the subject. Now, some people like Freeman Dyson draw inspiration from that. There'll always be mystery. See, some people like the mystery. I've never liked that. That's just purely a personal thing. I like to feel, yes, we can grasp this if we only put enough effort into it. I'm motivated by the thought that there is an answer out there, and that using scientific methods of inquiry, we can maybe get to what it is. But I have to concede that it may just be a mirage. Maybe we're just chasing after something that simply doesn't exist. Or maybe, and the point, the last paragraph of the book, I make the point that, and it was implicit in what you said, that our minds have evolved to solve certain problems. And we set up problems. The conceptual framework we use to discuss these sorts of things at this meeting, in terms of cause and effect, and gods and laws and mathematics and scientific method and so on, all of these things we've inherited from evolutionary happenstance. And it could be that now we can transcend these human limitations through artificial intelligence and building machines that can one day engage in intellectual inquiry that would be completely beyond us. And these would not be restricted by biological evolution to certain patterns of thought. Maybe they'll crack the problem, but maybe it would be completely incomprehensible to us because we simply can't put it into the language, into the conceptual framework that we've inherited from biology.
Yeah, just one more before we move on. Lawrence Krauss.
Two comments, Paul. One, just to put in perspective, I'm not sure that Stephen Hawking's picture of being able to limit what you can say about the past based on your observation of the present is really accepted as broadly as you might suggest. I think there are people who have big problems with that still. But
you mean other people have problems with Stephen's
interpretation of that?
I think
Yeah,
that's
limiting,
right. Yeah.
But on the question you gave, and it's again, it's a little technical, so I won't waste a lot of time here. But as you know, I've thought a lot about computing in the future, and this 122 bits worries me a little bit because it's kind of observer dependent. It's the computational power of a universe within the context of any given observer.
Right.
And so that the question to me of whether the universe is limited by a single observer it seems to me questionable, first. And secondly, the question of 400 entangled particles, whether, I think the question of whether that's going to use up all the bits in the universe, it depends upon, it can compute without, as long as it doesn't process that many bits, I don't see any problem.
Right. If you're a Platonist, it doesn't matter because it's computing in this Platonic heaven, and it doesn't.
Well, no, but I mean, it doesn't. The quantum evolution, I think, can be completely unitary as long as it doesn't process bits. But the more important question is the fact that I think this limitation of the universe based on an observer is something I would worry about.
You don't like that, right?
Yeah.
Right. Well, and of course, it'll appear mysterious to many people here as to why it's finite, and it has to do with the finite speed of light and age of the universe and so on. And so it does get.
But the actual universe itself is far bigger than the horizon of an individual observer. So therefore, it's not as limited.
So it's causally disconnected patches.
Yeah.
So you have to buy that is fundamentally significant, and that really is a matter of judgment as to whether you think something like the holographic principle, as say Lenny Susskind would, it really gets to the heart of what nature is about, or whether it's a sort of little technical extra.
So perhaps the two of you could get some paper and pencil out in the break and sort that one out. It'd be very easy.
Do I just sit down?
Yeah, I think just sit and we'll wait for Steve Nadler and then we'll have a conversation afterwards. And whoever's got the plaintively chirping cell phone, would they please attend to it as well? One of the things that we'd like to get onto later when Steve joins us and the other people join us is that obviously there is some connection here between the kind of universe you're talking about. You mentioned briefly Einstein, Podolsky, Rosen, so quantum entanglement and so on.
Right.
Which leads us on to John Stuart Bell and all those sorts of things. And the notion of a John Stuart Bell universe has some correlation with a Spinozistic universe, in my view, anyway.
Right.
And to discuss that properly, I think we need to hear about Spinoza,
Right.
who is often invoked by Einstein and was invoked by Carl Sagan. When they were asked which God did they believe in, they said Spinoza's God. So I thought it'd be useful at this point to have the chair of philosophy at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Steve Nadler, whose Life of Spinoza I commend to you as excellent reading. So this is Steve Nadler.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Since I'm going to broach questions of religion and morality, I thought I'd start with a Talmudic tale. A rabbi, a Catholic priest, and a Protestant minister at a religious retreat one day, and they decide to, on a very hot day, go out and frolic in the lake outside the place where they're holding this convention. Not having brought their swimming trunks, they have to skinny dip, and so they're having a very good time in the lake, and they hear some people walking through the woods. They shudder at the thought they might be caught out, so they quickly dash out of the water and run into the woods. And the Protestant minister and the Catholic priest run away with their hands covering their groin areas. The rabbi runs out of the water with his hand over his face. And after they get to a safe part in the woods, the minister and the priest turn to the rabbi and say, "Why were you running like that?" And the rabbi says, "Well, I don't know about you guys, but it's my face my congregants would recognize." Spinoza should be a hero to most of the people, many of the people sitting in this room. And so I was surprised that his name only came up once yesterday. And this is the 350th anniversary of his vitriolic and unprecedented expulsion from the Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam. There are lots of myths about Spinoza. He's often called a pantheist, a mystic, a Kabbalist. The Romantic poets called him that God-intoxicated philosopher. And I don't have time today to go over all of these myths, but I do want to focus on Spinoza's concern with the relationship between science, religious fundamentalism, and morality. and talk about his conception of God, and especially what we still have to learn today from Spinoza. First, I want to distinguish two species of religious fundamentalism. First, something I would call epistemological fundamentalism. Epistemological fundamentalism is the claim that the Bible is the Word of God, and if the Bible says P, whatever proposition P might be, if the Bible says P, P is therefore true. Right? If the Bible says P, P is true. A more extreme version of this would be a kind of literal fundamentalism. If the Bible says P, then P is literally true. But not all religious fundamentalists, epistemological fundamentalists, accept this very extreme literal version. So you might have claims like what Maimonides, for example, says. If the Bible says P, then P is true, but perhaps not literally true, at least figuratively true. Nonetheless, the Bible conveys truths. The second species of religious fundamentalism would be called moral fundamentalism. And this would be the claim that if God commands X, X is therefore the morally right and therefore obligatory thing to do. All right? That's moral fundamentalism. If God commands X, X is therefore morally right and thus obligatory. Or if God forbids X, X is morally wrong and one is therefore obliged not to do X. The important thing here is that if X is morally right, it's not just that X is morally permissible, it's that it's morally required. Now, to my mind, Plato took care of both of these types of fundamentalism. That is, the real Plato, not the quantum cosmic Plato embedded in the fabric of the universe, but the Plato who wrote beautiful literary philosophical dialogues. And in the Euthyphro, I think he takes care of both of these positions quite nicely. In fact, I think the Euthyphro should be required reading of every student the first semester they enter college. Spinoza also took care of them. I'll just mention something about the epistemological version, and then I want to focus on Spinoza and moral fundamentalism. With the epistemological fundamentalism, Spinoza took care of it by simply undermining the divine origin of Scripture. The Bible, and Spinoza was the first to say this, not just the first to say it systematically, but the first truly to say this. The Bible is not literally the work of God. It is a work of human literature, a compilation of writings by human beings passed down through generations, and finally put together by an editor or a team of editors in the Second Temple period, most likely Ezra. Therefore, reading the Bible is no different from reading Pride and Prejudice or any other work of human literature. And that means that what any sentence in the Bible means is not necessarily identical to what is true. Spinoza distinguishes between interpreting a work of literature in terms of trying to figure out what the meaning of the text is and interpreting it in terms of trying to discover what is absolutely true. And the Bible has no more priority in this regard than any other work of human literature. If it happens to convey certain truths, that's fine. But there's no necessary connection, not with Pride and Prejudice and not with the Bible, in Spinoza's view. There is no necessary connection between what its authors intend to say and what is the truth, scientific truth, historical truth, metaphysical truth, or philosophical truth. With regard to moral fundamentalism, and here's what I want to focus on, Spinoza will argue that the concept of God does not imply anything normative. You cannot derive any normative claims whatsoever from a true, metaphysically and philosophically true conception of God. Now, how does this work? A providential God, in order to exercise providence, would require a variety of psychological and moral characteristics. A providential God needs, for example, to have will and judgment, the ability to conceive plans, the desire to carry out those plans, and also the capacity to judge how well things conform to the plans that this God has proposed. Moreover, the traditional conception of a providential God requires a variety of moral characteristics. God must be wise, just, presumably good, and thus the judgments that God makes on the basis of how well things conform or do not conform to its plans will be based on a conception of what is, in objective terms, a good, something desirable for its own sake. Spinoza's God has none of the requisite psychological and moral characteristics required for the exercise of providence. Above all, Spinoza's God is numerically identical with nature. God is nature. Therefore, God has no will, intentions, or plans. God is not wise, just, good or providential in any sense whatsoever. There is no supernatural. The only thing that is nature. And God is identical with this nature. And whatever happens in the universe happens necessarily simply as a result of the laws and processes of nature. Spinoza, in other words, completely rejects the personal anthropomorphic conception of God that grounds traditional sectarian religions, which Spinoza regards simply as organized superstitions. Now, one of the very popular readings of Spinoza, one that you'd find both in the 17th and 18th centuries and also in the most recent edition of the Cambridge Dictionary of Philosophy, Spinoza is often called a pantheist, a way of preserving a kind of religiosity in Spinoza. And I think nothing could be further from the truth. Well, I mean, there are things that would be further from the truth, but this is pretty far from the truth. Spinoza was not a Catholic. That would be further from the truth as well. There are two varieties of pantheism. Here's one variety of pantheism. All pantheisms share the basic claim that God is nature, or God is in nature. And one way of understanding that is to think of God as a supernatural element within nature, kind of like water in a sponge. That certainly cannot be Spinoza's view, because God is not simply in nature as a supernatural element residing within the world of nature, because Spinoza has no conception of the supernatural. All there is nature. Whatever is purely natural. Another variety of pantheism, however, would agree with that ontological claim. There's nothing but nature. There's no supernatural element beyond nature. There's no supernatural element within nature. However, the pantheist would still say God is nature. And you might ask, well, what's the difference between that and atheism? My claim would be that Spinoza is truly an atheist in the following sense. If there's any difference between a pantheist and an atheist, it's not going to be in the ontology if they both agree that all there is nature. So the differences are going to have to lie in the proper psychological attitude to take towards nature. And as far as I can tell, what the pantheists must mean when they claim that God is nature, or God is in nature, is that nature is therefore deserving of worshipful awe, a kind of religious attitude, perhaps even fear or dread. And nature might be the object of a religious experience. And there's no room whatsoever in Spinoza's philosophy for worshipful awe or any type of reverential attitude towards nature. The proper attitude to take towards nature is scientific understanding, a deep investigation of its secrets, the laws that operate, and why things come about with the necessity that they do. To stand in front of nature with an attitude of worshipful awe, for Spinoza, he likens that to gaping at it like a fool. And that's simply the path to the irrational passions of hope and fear. The minute you stand in front of nature with worshipful awe, you start to become you're overcome by perhaps fear of what might happen or hope for what might come. And these, for Spinoza, are harmful passions. And the way to diminish the force of these passions in our lives and achieve some modicum of well-being and tranquility and peace of mind is through intellectual understanding, not through the passions. So Spinoza is not a pantheist. He is an atheist. There's no room whatsoever for any type of religious attitude in the face of God or nature. There's also nothing whatsoever that is moral about God or nature. Because Spinoza's God lacks the proper psychological characteristics, God can make no commands or judgments upon us. There's no way in which God can literally issue commands to act or proscriptions against acting in any way whatsoever. Now, I might add, as a non-Spinozistic footnote, although I'm sure he would agree with this, that even if, here's one of the things I found awfully confusing about yesterday. Even if one does believe that there is a providential God issuing commands, and what I was confused about yesterday was the claim that Professor Roughgarden suggested that I don't see how there can be ethics or morality without God. My problem is the opposite. I don't see what God, even if there is a providential God issuing commands, I don't see what that could possibly have to do with morality. If there is a providential God issuing commands, assume for a minute that there is, I fail to see how it follows from the fact that God commands a certain action, that therefore that action is the moral thing to do. I see very well how if God commands X, then doing X would be the religious thing to do, or doing X would be the pious thing to do. That seems to follow almost trivially. But what I don't see is why God commanding X makes X a moral or ethical thing to do. Well, back to Spinoza. For Spinoza, there is no intrinsic morality in nature. God is not good or evil. Nature is not good or evil. Nature just is. Whatever happens simply happens as a result of the laws and could not have been otherwise. The definition of good, according to Spinoza, is simply what best serves an individual's true interests. What is good for me is what is in my best interest. That is what maximizes my power of surviving and navigating the obstacles of nature, somehow avoiding the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. What is bad is what is detrimental to my nature, what will harm me, what will stand in my way of thriving as a rational being. This doesn't mean that Spinoza is some rampant egoist who thinks that I have no moral duties to others, because it is in fact in my own best interest to ensure that other people act in certain ways. I think Socrates, in the Apology, put this quite well. When Socrates is defending himself against the claim that he's corrupted his fellow citizens of Athens, Socrates' defense is basically, what do you think I am, an idiot? I have to live with these people. Why would I act in such a way that corrupts them when I would have to continue to live among corrupted individuals? Therefore, your claim is patently absurd. Well, Spinoza is, I think, inspired by this claim of Socrates. And while his moral philosophy is thoroughly egoistic in the sense that all motivation for acting ethically is self-interest, he hopes to have demonstrated that it is in your own self-interest to see other people become as virtuous and thrive as rational beings as you do. So Spinoza, then, is an atheist for whom ethical behavior has nothing whatsoever to do with the truth of religious beliefs. Religious stories, and especially the stories of the Bible, can reinforce ethical behavior. And Spinoza is not beyond conceding that the people who wrote the Bible were outstanding moral teachers. But this doesn't mean that they were scientists, philosophers, metaphysicians, historians, or had any access to what is true. What they saw was that certain type of stories can inspire us to moral behavior. But morality itself, the foundations of morality, are independent of theology. Well, this brings us to, I think, maybe was what is often the thought behind the view that there can be no morality with God. Why then be moral if there is no eternal reward or punishment? If it's not a hope for a reward in heaven or fear of punishment in hell, what is the possible motivation for doing the right thing, for being a moral person? Now, I want to distinguish that from another question which philosophers are always concerned about, and that would be the question of weakness of will, or crasia, or incontinence. The problem of incontinence or weakness of the will is not why should I be moral, but why is it the case that sometimes knowing what the moral thing to do is and being motivated to do the moral thing, I fail to do it? I know that I should do A, and I want to do A. And somehow, in the end, I fail to do A. That's the problem of weakness of the will. The motivation problem is, I know what is the right thing to do is, I see exactly what morality demands, and yet I can still ask, why should I do it? I feel no motivation to do what is right. And this is the problem that philosophers have struggled with, particularly once you've eliminated a theological superstructure for morality. Kant wrestled with it. Utilitarian philosophers like Mill wrestled with it. Spinoza, I think, once you've grounded ethics in self-interest, without giving up on moral duties to others, you can short-circuit the motivation problem because the motivation is built into the nature of morality itself. Once you see that human beings are naturally motivated by self-interest, in Spinoza's view, you can then move on to the weakness of will problem. Not ask why should we be motivated to do good, but then ask why do people ever fail to do what is right. What then do we have to learn today from Spinoza? Let me just suggest two things. First of all, there was lots of talk yesterday about how we can never prove that there is no personal transcendent God. In fact, Spinoza, as far as I can tell, is one philosopher at least who did think you could demonstrate with absolute certainty that there is no personal transcendent God. By demonstrating what nature is, an eternal, infinite substance, actively generating everything that happens. And then taking the traditional definition of God, an eternal, infinite substance who generates everything that happens, and show that one necessarily implies the other, you can demonstrate in the fact that if you truly understand what God is and truly understand what nature is, you can demonstrate that there is no such thing as a personal, transcendent God, the God of sectarian religions. Secondly, Spinoza also shows us that there's a path. By giving up on religion, you don't necessarily have to give up on questions about the meaning of life. In fact, you have a much clearer path to answering them. Spinoza, I think, introduces, and here, this is not something that Spinoza dealt with directly, but I think in Spinoza, we have a very nice analytical distinction between questions about the meaning of life and questions about the origins of life and the purpose of life. For Spinoza, you don't need to answer questions about the origin of life or the purpose of life to answer questions about the meaning of life. There's a problem with Spinoza in that he absolutely rejects free will. So what you cannot find in Spinoza is a kind of existentialist conception of the meaning of life. It's whatever you and your absolute freedom decide to make of it. But nonetheless, I think a great deal is gained by distinguishing questions about the meaning of life from questions about where life came from, why are we, what brought us here, and where are we going. Bayle, one of those 17th century impresarios, I think summed up the value of Spinoza quite nicely when he said, Bayle absolutely abhorred Spinoza's philosophy. He called it a dangerous atheism, and yet he said that Spinoza's life shows us that one could be a perfectly virtuous person without believing in God. Thank you. Did you want me to remain up there? Or?
Can stay there, it's fine. So, Joan, yes. Since you were invoked.
Thanks. Two things, if I might. First, and I enjoyed your presentation very much. First, I agree with you about the distinction between someone following God's commandment, as it were, as being religious and not necessarily as being moral. But if you also say that, or grant, that the writers of the Bible were good moral teachers, then, so to speak, the teachings of the commandments of God become coextensive with moral teachings. And so I wasn't drawing that fine distinction when I was referring to moral behavior being conducted, if you will, in the context of a religious tradition. Secondly, I have never claimed and do not claim that a religious tradition is necessary for moral thought. I'm expressing the empirical point that I'm skeptical of the possibility of developing a moral tradition or a moral philosophy even outside of the context of these. And I think the burden of proof is on witnessing the success, if it should ever come about, of a purely secular ethical tradition. So I do want to emphasize that that's an empirical claim, and I'm entitled to empirical skepticism about that possibility.
Is it a skepticism about the motivation to be moral, or a skepticism about the capacity to make and justify claims about morality?
It's the latter. It's about the possibility of even developing self-consistent moral claims.
But then in that case, okay, so it's not a question about getting people to be moral, but coming up with a systematic series of ethical propositions. But in that case, go back to your first claim. When you say that the biblical writers perhaps had some deep moral insights.
Which you claim, which you acknowledge.
Correct.
Yeah.
But what would make them deep moral insights was that there's this independent system of morality with which their views happen to coincide. In other words, the claims that they're making are not moral because they're making them. They're moral because there's this coherent system of morality which they happen to reflect, we find reflected in the Bible. Otherwise, and here you get the Euthyphro problem from Socrates. Remember, in the dialogue, Euthyphro is going off to prosecute his father for murder. And Socrates says, why are you doing that? And Euthyphro says, well, it's the pious thing to do. So Euthyphro says, well, Socrates says, so tell me, what is piety? Euthyphro says, well, piety is what the gods love. In other words, something is pious because the gods love it.
Uh-huh.
And I was assuming when you described your first view that that's not what you were saying. It's not moral because you find it in the Bible, but rather these biblical writers had sufficient moral insight to take these moral propositions, which seem self-evident or derivable from other higher propositions, and include them in their stories. Otherwise, you're stuck in Euthyphro's problem that if it's pious just because the gods love it, then the gods could have loved something different, and then that would have been pious, and then the gods fall into irrationality and capriciousness.
Harvey, would you like to say something? Please introduce yourself.
Harvey Carton, UCSD. I wonder if you could comment on an issue that comes into society increasingly in terms of the legal system now, where the Supreme Court refers to things such as natural law. How does that fit in with all of the concept of an insistence upon a universal morality, which actually reflects a very strong bias of the background of the people who judge it?
It depends what's meant by natural law. If by natural...
Not the Natural Law Party, I hope. Do you know about these people?
No.
The Natural Law Party that contested British elections. You know these people? Yeah, the superstring Lagrangian and all that stuff. Yeah, they believe in levitation. Gives new meaning to the term floating voter.
It's unnatural law.
They promise we'll be able to levitate ourselves if they win? Is that... Yeah.
Sorry.
If by natural law, you could mean simply the laws of nature, namely laws that capture with generalizations the way things actually behave and predict the behavior of other items. In that case, it's perfectly consistent with Spinoza to see him as a natural law theorist about morality because, like the ancient Stoics, what is right and what is good is what is in accordance with nature. Sometimes that's meant what's in accordance with human nature, namely that what will cause human nature to flourish. And in our case, what would cause us to flourish is the acquisition of knowledge, and especially a knowledge of our own place in the natural scheme of things. If by nature, on the other hand, you mean that there's inscribed in the world some normative claims, that's a much stronger claim, and I think that might indeed be harder to justify. It's certainly impossible to justify on Spinoza's grounds. But usually the natural law theory refers to normative claims inscribed into nature, which I think is more dubious.
You already have the mic. Go ahead.
Sure. Adam Kolber, law professor, University of San Diego. As you mentioned at the end, it could very well be the case that you can be virtuous even if you're an atheist. But it seems like religion probably has some effect on one's level of virtue. It could make it higher, it could make it lower. It could be the same, but so there's this open question, and people have made comments throughout that might touch on that question, the empirical question of which way it does affect us, but arguably it's still an open question. So my question for you is how we discuss this with each other is conveying information, potentially altering people's views. The question has been raised, do we do that respectfully, or need it not be respectful in some sense? And isn't it itself a moral issue how you communicate it, because it may have the effect of making people more virtuous or less virtuous?
Absolutely. First of all, let me say, I think I'm sure I agree with Professor Roughgarden that very often religious beliefs are a good motivator to ethical behavior. It would be foolish to take issue with that empirical claim. And I entirely agree with you. And I think, again, Spinoza's right about one thing. He says often in his correspondence, I abhor confrontation. And when his landlady, who was a devout member of the Dutch Reformed Church, said, will I be saved in my religion? He says, yeah, don't worry about it. Right? In other words, if it's helping you to lead a good life and achieve the degree of happiness that's achievable in this world, absolutely. Spinoza denied the immortality of the soul. There's no such thing as personal immortality after. after this life. If virtue has any rewards, it's going to be in this lifetime, and it's going to be through the tranquility and peace of mind that it brings you. And to become confrontational would seem to be at cross purposes with the whole objective of encouraging others towards virtue.
So if it turned out that theism makes people more virtuous, you'd have this tough bind between sort of conveying true statements or statements that you believe to be true with this possible negative effect on their behavior, their lives, their quality of lives, their society.
Well, that suggests that there are equally good ways to become virtuous, and that's what I'm not persuaded of. It's if false beliefs are effective in moving people towards virtue, fine. But what bothers many philosophers in relying on false beliefs and the passions they generate to motivate virtue is that these are very unreliable and changeable things. Kant, I think, had a very clear view that if people are going to be virtuous, you want it to be grounded in something that is permanent and immutable, namely the dictates of reason, not our personal inclinations, passions, and hopes and fears.
Let's just take one question from Harry Croto, and then we'll have to move on.
Just
we can
comment, really.
Do this later.
With regard to the Bible, and I'm not a big expert on it, but there are sections of it that I think today we would consider rather unethical to actually follow those particular recipes for how we should behave. The second thing is, I think people, again, I'm not an expert, but I read a bit that packs of monkeys, certainly within the tribe, and to some extent outside, actually behave pretty ethically without reading the Bible. So, I mean, it's open to question, but so there are these two areas that I think make biologists, and me as well, as an onlooker on biology, very skeptical about some of the claims you just made with regard to things like secularity. You're skeptical, which is reasonable to be, that we can't behave in a reasonable manner to each other if we don't read the Bible. And secondly, that there are many things that I think are abhorrent, certainly to me, and to many people who may be even fundamentalist, Christians, and particularly in the Quran, have a real problem actually thinking that these are moral and ethically good things to do.
Thanks, Harry. There's a couple of points there. We'd like to get somebody later on to talk about that. The point you made about ethical monkeys, I think, needs a little bit of expansion. There's some really interesting stuff on that, and it can be pretty raw out there. The other thing about the language of the Bible, it occurs to me that the one that most people quote, at least in this country, is the King James Version, which is being written at the same time as the gunpowder plot was being hatched. And the language of that, which is so extraordinary and soaring, was actually put together by a committee of 58 people. It's about the only time that anybody's brought anything soaring in terms of language out of a group of 58 people. Until today, of course. I would actually like to use that prerogative to shift slightly based on what Steve has just said. It seems to me more natural that we actually go to Pat Churchland now and then come to Loyal Rue afterwards. Sorry to spring that on you, but if you could put your tennis shoes on. Pat Churchland is the professor of philosophy and chair of the Department of Philosophy at UCSD and has written some wonderful books, a seminal book which founded kind of a sub-discipline, if you like, on neurophilosophy. And her latest book is Brainwise. And I'm just vamping while she gets her equipment together. Paul will later, as I said yesterday, I think, give us his version of Dan Dennett. And we have a couple of slides of Dan as a sailor and then from his hospital bed as a bed sailor. And we'll do that a little bit later on. And Kent, could you come and help with this?
Just need to hitch it up.
We can take another Steve Nadler question while we're waiting. Bill Hurlbert, why don't you have one? Can we get a microphone to you? Borrow mine. You've had so many questions. Come on.
This is a rather easy question, just for clarification. So you basically said that Spinoza replaces principle with prudence when it comes to moral behavior, that good is what best serves an individual's interest, and then you define it as survival and thriving as a rational being. So the latter category seems to me to be not at all self-evident from what would serve a person's interest. But first, let me ask you about the survival side of it. So it's obvious that certain types of behaviors that you can get away with because they're invisible to the larger public or effective things, or because their effects are long-term bad but short-term beneficial to you individually, could bypass that concern. So that's the first question. The second is, why is thriving as a rational being the definition of the good, when so much in biology would indicate to us that disproportions and passions may serve positive ends for the individual or his place within nature? And just finally, the quote from Nietzsche, where he says, "To be natural is to be as amoral as nature is."
Going back to the first question, that's the challenge, I think, that anybody who bases their moral philosophy in egoism has to address. And I think what you have to demonstrate is, I mean, the problem of giving up long-term interest for short-term interest goes to the heart of the problem of akrasia, namely, often why we do things that we recognize to be wrong is because we mistake, or we give priority to our short-term interests over our long-term interests. And Spinoza is very careful with that question to show that once a person recognizes, I mean, of course, the trouble is you have to buy into Spinoza's entire metaphysics of nature. But assuming we do that for the moment, the person who sees things with the greatest clarity recognizes the necessity of everything that happens in nature as a result of nature's laws. And the result of that, seeing this necessity, is that this person is not moved more by short-term gain than by long-term gain, because the kind of perspective they take on the course of their life is what he calls an eternal perspective. That is, they're able to abstract for the moment from the short-term pleasures of the moment to recognize that the well-being of the body is not the only thing that needs to be taken into account. In a way, it's again a Socratic claim that there's a hierarchy of goods for a human being that are not determined by biology, but are determined by philosophical inquiry. I didn't want to say more because I know that Pat's waiting. So.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, sorry, I'm slightly breathless because I wasn't expecting to come on right now. Yep. Microphone.
Oh, here.
Do I have to stand still?
No.
Oh, good.
I was hoping to take it home, but I guess.
That would be hard for me. Okay. Yeah, Spinoza really makes the perfect segue for what I want to say. And I think that the issues of morality and where morality comes from and how we get to a moral point of view is really important, because many scientists, famously Stephen Jay Gould, took the view that morality should be handled by religion, and that we can, within science, talk about other things, but morality is in the province of religion, and I think that's really quite wrong. So what I want to do today is to say a little bit about some of the new discoveries that have been made in neuroscience, behavioral neuroscience, as well as endocrinology. Some of you will have heard the story of the voles already, but it's a great story, and I'm assuming not everybody will know that story. The basic position that I want to suggest is really very close to Spinoza, which is going to say that evolution essentially sets the style of drives and emotions and motivations that a brain has. And of course, it will differ a little bit species to species. Experience in a culture, whether it's a baboon culture, chimpanzee, human, vole, will also then shape the style into very specific kinds of habits and preferences as a function of the institutions that exist in the culture into which you happen to be born. Paul MacLean, who is a neuroscientist who thought a lot about emotions in the 1960s, made a very interesting observation. He said that what is new with mammals, and I'm going to put birds aside because birds are very special and they share many properties with higher mammals, but what is new with mammals as opposed to reptiles is the emergence of nursing and parental care, playful behavior, the separation vocalization when the young is separated from the parent, and mate attachment. And he said this he was given to saying sort of faintly prophetic things. And he said the history of the evolution of mammals is the history of the development of a family way of life. Now, what inspired him was the thought that in something like lactation behavior, there is a very special bond that forms. And he thought, and it turned out he's quite right about this, that it was mediated by neuromodulators. And in fact, what we know now is that although oxytocin used to be thought to be simply involved in bodily functions such as milk letdown and uterine contractions during delivery, we now know that it also works in the brain. So when the mother suckles the child actually gets oxytocin in the milk itself, but it's the cuddling and the warmth. It produces an oxytocin release both in the mother and in the infant. And what's known now also is that the oxytocin release is involved in pathways that connect to the nucleus accumbens, which is part of the reward system. So you really have the beginnings of an understanding of the nature of social attachment. But it gets a lot more interesting. It gets more interesting because a number of people, Sue Carter, Larry Young, Tom Insel, noticed something really very interesting about voles. There are several species of voles. They are not interbreedable. The prairie vole is a monogamous pair bonder. The two, after the first mating, essentially pair for life. And they have a nest, they protect the nest, they reject intruders. And the other thing about them is that they are biparental. Both male and female take an extensive role in the rearing of the pups. The montane vole is just different. It's quite a successful animal in its own niche, but the montane vole is promiscuous. So, and moreover, it turns out that the montane vole, not only do they not form long-term mate attachments, but the females are not as long-term and intensively caring with respect to the pups. So there's maternal differences as well. Now, when they began to try to understand what might be the difference between the two, a very important discovery was made with regard to oxytocin and with regard to vasopressin. Now, both species have distributions of receptors for these simple peptides. And within a species, both sexes have a distribution. But what they discovered, and I just sort of, I'll come back to that slide in a minute, was a sort of astonishingly simple result. And that is that in male prairie voles, you can predict the degree of monogamy, or you can predict how attached they will be as a function of the density of vasopressin receptors in certain very specific parts of the brain. And with females, you can predict their attachment by a mirror image in effect, and that's the distribution of oxytocin receptors in certain very specific parts of the brain. I found this to be just an astonishing result, because here is something that many people have thought is really a cultural concept, that is whether you should be monogamous or whether you should be promiscuous, and it turns out that it's importantly related to your specific biochemistry. Now, they did all of the controls and the manipulations that you can imagine, and that is they blocked the vasopressin receptors in the prairie voles, and they did indeed become promiscuous, and they put extra stuff into the montane voles, and they did become monogamous pair bonders, and they did all of those sorts of controls. At the genetic level, they made a very interesting discovery. Of course, there is, as you would predict, a genetic difference bearing upon the expression of vasopressin receptors in the brains. But they did another thing that was, in a way, more interesting. Within the prairie vole population, there is a distribution of the degree of attachment to the mate. And, alas, not supposed to do that. And so they isolated the part on chromosome 17. They isolated the part that produces the vasopressin protein. And they found a region that regulates the expression that is fairly close to it, and they called it a microsatellite part of DNA. Now, what you see in this slide, and I do apologize for the graininess of the slide, is that amongst the prairie voles that do not form strong attachment bonds, the microsatellite region for regulating the vasopressin receptor is really quite small, and in the strong pair bonders, it's quite large. And then the question is, how does that correspond to behavior? And that's what's illustrated here. So variability in receptor density is controlled by the gene, and so on and so forth. So how does this really have to do with Spinoza? Well, I'm getting there. But I want to make one other sort of small foray. There is, I think, a very common belief, it's certainly widespread amongst philosophers, that it is an axiom that you cannot derive an ought from an is. That there is this huge gap between facts and values, and that in order to have a decision about what you ought to do, you have to have some kind of unconditional foundation of value that tells you what unconditionally you ought to do. And I actually think that's wrong, and I think I will tell you why I think that that's wrong. The evolutionary point, of course, is that what we care about acts as the framework for what we value. So we do, of course, value food, water, sex, oxygen. But it's also the case that built into our wiring, and we can see this rather beautifully in the case of the prairie and montane voles, is that social animals also care profoundly and strongly about offspring, about mates, about parents, and about kin. Now, so what is all this stuff then about not deriving an ought from an is? Well, in a certain sense, everything hinges on what you mean by derive. In logic, we formally mean that a derivation is a valid argument. And the standard example is if P, then Q, P, therefore Q. If it rains, then the sidewalk is wet. It rains, so the sidewalk is wet. In contrast, it would be a fallacy to say if it rains, then the sidewalk is wet, therefore it rained. It might be the sprinkler, it might be the dogs, who knows. But in fact, and Terry made this point rather beautifully yesterday, most of everyday life and most of science doesn't involve valid arguments and derivation at all. It involves an inference to the best hypothesis, to the best explanatory hypothesis, given the data that are available. And then if new data becomes available and it conflicts with that hypothesis, we revise it. And that's what most of life is about. I see my child come in. She has a bunch of little red spots on her arm. I look at it. I know it's summer. She's been out in the bush. I infer that she's got poison ivy. Inference to the best explanation. Famously, Richard Gregory Rama's supervisor made the same observation about most of perception. The brain is making an inference to the best explanation. And this wonderful illusion, it turns out that square A and square B are actually the same color. And it's very easy to show if I could manipulate it. You just move them together. And they are, in fact, the same. But, of course, the brain infers that you've got a uniform checkerboard and that the pillar is casting a shadow. Inference to the best explanation. And I'm sure you've all seen the little biowalker, just a bunch of dots. The brain infers that it's a person running along. Now, with regard then to morals, and here I think I can come back to the basic Spinoza point, we constantly make inference to the best decision. We do it in a prudential fashion. I ought to get my tires inflated. I don't have a fundamental rule about getting my tires inflated. Right? I see that they're low. I think that it could be unwise to run the car with low tires. I ought to get my tires inflated. But this also happens constantly, regularly, in the most normal of cases in the moral domain. I see my neighbor's lights are on. And he left his car lights on. I ought to tell him. I'm walking through the bush. I see a grizzly with cubs. When I emerge from the bush, I see hikers coming in. I know I ought to tell them. Not that I unconditionally ought to tell them. Not that I have a fundamental moral law. It's just that that's what I have come. That's the expression of a skill that I have come to acquire as a result of living in this culture. So the story that I want to tell is that most moral behavior does not rest on a fundamental moral ought. And the reason that we're able to pick and choose from the Bible is that we come as a result of socialization, background education, and the fundamental wiring that evolution provides. We're able to say, despite what it says in Exodus, it's wrong to stone your child to death for dishonoring you. I mean, it does say that you do that. I've never done that, and I would never do that. It also says in Exodus that you shall not suffer a witch to live. I will not, go on a witch hunt. I will not do that. And that's, I think, exactly what Steve Nadler was saying, which is that we bring a huge amount of moral knowledge to bear. We acquire it from imitation of our peers, from modeling ourselves after our parents. We acquire it enormously through stories and through observation of what happens to people. And, part of the reason that we're fascinated by Leona Hemsley going to jail for cheating on her taxes is that we think, God, that can really happen. And it's those sorts of things that over time, and in a way we don't understand, just as we don't really understand how factual knowledge is integrated and made more or less coherent, we don't really understand the mechanisms behind that kind of learning. But there are people who are working, of course, on the neurobiology of these things, including people in Terry's lab. So ultimately, I think Spinoza needn't say that it's always in our interest, although in a certain very deep sense that Richard Dawkins, I think, particularly understands. Of course, ultimately, our social behavior is as it is, and our social wiring is as it is, because Mother Nature cares about the genes. So there is, I think, a very important understanding of the nature of morality that has nothing to do with religion. And like Steve, I think it's really worrisome to say that you'll burn in hell if you don't do it, so you got to do it. I think there are better ways of ensuring moral motivation than scaring the crap out of people. Okay, thanks. Did you want me to, what do I do now?
You could just join the panel here,
Okay.
and we'll take some
You're
questions.
asking what ought you to do now, or?
Yes, what ought I to do now? And do you have a fundamental rule that
Are you
will tell
treating
me
me
what
as
I ought to
God?
do?
Is that what's happening? Carolyn.
Just a comment. It sounds like you're saying you not only don't have to scare the crap out of people, I mean that we shouldn't scare the crap out of people, you don't have to.
You don't have to. It's
Okay,
there.
it's there already.
Social motivation is very, very powerful. But let me say, in most people. So there is such a thing as a sociopath. And what do you do to those people? Well, it doesn't help if you convert them to a religion. And it doesn't help if you just try to scare them. They're very dangerous, they're very scary, and people with, frontal symptoms in general are very scary. And we have to deal with them. And that's a whole sort of other talk. And maybe someday we'll actually find ways of neurally intervening, to bring about better socialization. But by and large, you don't have to teach, just as you do not have to teach a mother to love the baby that she's suckling. If she doesn't, we assume there's something pathological, and all of the exhortation in the world makes not a whit of difference. But by and large, the biochemistry is just hugely powerful.
Last week I went on a radio show called Fox News, and there were people phoning in, and one man phoned in, and he said that if he didn't believe in God, there would be nothing to stop him killing and raping and stealing. And so I said, you mean you would kill if you didn't believe in God? And he said, yes. And I said, who would you kill? He said, I would kill my neighbor.
Really? Well, I'm sure that his neighbor should definitely be on the lookout.
I said, you're not a very good advertisement for religion, but I suspect he's not that uncommon.
Yeah, violent behavior is of course very, very, very worrisome. And the other part of the story that I think is really important, and I know some of you have heard me go on about this before, but I like to think that, we found this animal model now for social attachment, and we want to understand how you extend the attachment beyond the immediate family to the group, as it does, say, in baboons and chimps and so forth. But what I want is an animal model for in-group attachment and out-group hostility, because that's where the real killing lies. That's where it is in the case of chimpanzees. We all know now that chimpanzees do this thing where the males get together of an evening, things are nice, no problems. They go quietly creeping off, and they get to the border of their territory. They find a lone chimp. They don't sort of kill it in the way they would if they were hungry. They kick it, they bite it, they rip it apart, they leave it to die in the most miserable way, or else they kill it. And we do it. We humans do that. And what I'd like to know is what the biochemistry is there, and how to, as Roger would say, how to incentivize us so that that doesn't happen. But that's the real moral issue, I think.
It's actually
and the
worse than
Bible
this.
actually doesn't seem to say you can't do that. And a lot of folks in the Bible do just that.
I think it's important to point out that in those killings as well, that the genitals are ripped off.
That's right.
If you know anything about inclusive fitness, you'd have at least a story on why that would be a place to be attacked. Ralph Greenspan.
Yeah, Ralph Greenspan, Neurosciences Institute. I also want to extend the evolutionary aspect of this a step further, because as you sort of alluded to, there is actually a great deal of genetic variation in the prairie voles.
Yes.
As to how much they have.
That's right.
Which means that it is not under such strong selection that it takes over the population.
That's right.
So there is an interesting tension, which may well be the source of many of our ills, between the cultural and social imperatives of conformity and the genetic imperative of variation.
Yeah, that's very interesting, Ralph. I mean, that's a really deep point.
Somebody already up there has a microphone. Oh, it's Dan Siegel.
Yeah. Hi, Dan Siegel from UCLA Department of Psychiatry and the Center for Culture, Brain, and Development. Thank you for your talk and introducing attachment. Just to address 3 areas of science that people may be familiar with, but just to tie them into, with your presentation. In my own work, I work in the field of attachment research, and trying to look at the fundamental ways where families, in fact, have a kind of moral compass that, as you're saying, is kind of natural to the way they are. In human beings, we have a whole field of science, actually, that looks into this. And rather than just looking at genetics, we actually see experience, and in very deep ways and across the generations, finding transmission of behaviors you might call unethical, or at least not optimal for thriving. And in fact, we have interventions that can alter those paths. So there actually is a lot of empirical data about that. But to address the other issues in terms of these neural mediators of in-out membership response, 2 studies sort of come to mind. One are certainly terror management or mortality salient studies, where you expose someone to a sense of danger and even subliminally images of death, and then you find that there's a intensification of the evaluation of the individual they're presented with subsequently as being either an in-group or out-group. The in-group person is treated with more kindness. The out-group person is treated with a lot more hostility. Now, just building on that, which is not a neural study, but there's some unpublished work that's coming out of Harvard and Dartmouth that actually shows that if you present faces, that is photographs of people to, these are Dartmouth undergraduates, but anyway, to college students, you can show that the medial prefrontal cortex is activated. This is an area involved in theory of mind and empathy. It's activated if the small written summary is such that the Dartmouth college student will feel that that person is like them. So it'll be a given face. Let's say it's a face of a Korean individual. They'll say, this person, graduated college at Dartmouth, went on to Cambridge, works at a .com, loves, this kind of activity. The person's medial prefrontal activity is high. They show the same photograph, only the summary of the same exact face says, this person grew up in Seoul, he never graduated high school, works in a garage, and likes to play with Barbie dolls, and there's no medial prefrontal activation. And the person just has no sense of connection. So we're learning that, in fact, there are these neural mechanisms of in-out group membership, and there are ways that we can consider in terms of a society that's based on science of actually promoting awareness of that, so that, in fact, you don't go ahead and rip people's genitals off if you're aware, in fact, that if something happens in a country that makes you have mortality salience activated, you're very likely to look at people not like you and go blow them up. So if you actually used your prefrontal cortex to rise above those kinds of innate biological reactions, you might actually alter the course of human history.
Dan, I think there's a couple of good points there, and we'll be going to those later this afternoon. The lady in the red over there with the scarf on is Mazrin Banaji, and you guys should talk.
Yeah.
Mazrin will be talking about this a little later on.
I was just going to...
Do you want to respond before?
Well, I was just going to follow up by, in case not everybody knows this experiment, but Paul Zak then asked, well, how could, if oxytocin, which it turns out in animal studies to show that it lowers anxiety levels and makes people, feel a little more comfortable and so forth. So Paul Zak and some guys thought, well, suppose we put it in an aerosol and just shoot it up people's nose, because the olfactory bulb is the fast way into the brain. I won't summarize exactly how the data went. But it was one of these tasks where, you give somebody money and you have to trust them that they will give you money back and so forth. The basic line is that the people who got the oxytocin up the nose were much more trusting than the normal controls. And then they did it not with oxytocin up the nose, but just with massage. I really like this one. And if you just give the undergraduates a really nice massage before they go in to play this game, they act as though they had oxytocin.
Oh, that's obviously Ted Haggard's solution.
Yeah, but he didn't take it.
We'll get onto that later. So just to let you know, there is actually circulating oxytocin in here right now. Sam.
Yeah, Sam Harris, infidel. So I thought both Pat and Steve brought together some very necessary pieces of perspectives here. I just want to try to push it a little bit further to allay the fears of religious people who, it seems to me that this question of morality really is the Gordian knot that needs to be cut at the level of our culture, that the link, the imagined link between morality and religion is really the myth that is circulating here that we should deflate, and I think you have said that the necessary things to deflate it. Two things. One is that this idea that we should be skeptical that atheism can foster the basis for a civil society. I think it's instructive to look at the most atheistic societies in the developed world. The one you find we in the United States are really an outlier. If you take the top 20 societies as ranked by the UN's Development Index, which incorporates almost every indices of moral behavior that you'd be interested in, like violent crime and infant mortality and generosity to the developed world, you find that, first of all, the U.S. is the only society, with the possible exception of Ireland in the top 20, that really lives at all under the shadow of this kind of religiosity. And the other societies are the most atheistic societies around, apart from the communist bloc societies, which have their own dogmatism to worry about. But you look at societies like Holland and Denmark and Australia and Iceland and Norway, societies where the level of belief in God is really the inverse. I mean, they're all like the National Academy of Sciences, essentially, in Sweden, on this question of a personal God. The other, well, if it's ridiculous, we can address it. But it's the level of atheism in Sweden is somewhere between 60 and 85%, depending on how the question is asked. The other piece, though, is that this question of whether there are really right and wrong answers to questions of good and evil. When you translate good and evil into questions of happiness and suffering, which I think you have and which I think Spinoza has, you need only posit that there are really right and wrong answers to questions of how human beings and other conscious beings can maximize their happiness. And it seems to me we have very good reason to believe that there are right and wrong answers there. And we know that something, for instance, like honor killing or female genital mutilation is not a good strategy to maximize human happiness, to raise people to feel compassion for other people, for instance. And we know that compassion and love and even self-transcending love can be part of an enlightened selfishness that of the sort that Spinoza may advocate. And so this opposition between selfishness and selflessness breaks down when you talk about how we can maximize happiness, and there's just massive convergence there. And I think if Michael Persinger could get his helmet perfectly tuned so as to dial in, every state of mind that people think is a happy one, we would have convergence. I mean, we'd be able to say, well, Dalai Lama state number 21 is almost as good as Dalai Lama state number 23, and maybe we wouldn't have perfect convergence, but we would have. It wouldn't be that every possible brain state is equivalent at the level of happiness, and so.
For technical reasons, like a tape change, we actually have to take a break now, which is probably a good idea. So we could take a very brief break, and we'll come back after the break, and this conversation will continue.